The beacon came from a dead system. That was the first thing that made it strange. The Arithon cluster had been catalogued as uninhabited for over a century. 3 planets too close to their star, a 4th too far, a debris field where a 5th had once tried and failed to hold an orbit. There was nothing there worth noting. The Galactic Survey Commission had filed its assessment 63 years prior and moved on to more interesting coordinates. So when the navigation buoys along the outer helix corridor began registering a low-frequency pulse from the direction of Arithon, the automated systems did what automated systems do. They logged it. They time-stamped it. They assigned it a reference number, NB447 Delta, and placed it in a processing queue that would, under normal operational circumstances, be reviewed within the next 4 to 6 standard weeks. It was reviewed in 3 days, because a Yulhari signals analyst named Suvat happened to be running a routine audit of the corridor buoys for an entirely unrelated purpose, and she happened to be very good at her job, and she happened to notice something that the automated systems had not been programmed to find. The beacon was not malfunctioning equipment. It was not stellar interference. It was not a ghost signal from some ancient probe left over from an era before the current navigation infrastructure existed. It was a deliberate transmission, compressed, layered, encoded in a format that had not been used in active galactic communication for approximately 60 years. Suvat sat with that fact for a long time before she told anyone. She was the senior diplomatic observer for the Yulhari Nested Union, a species known throughout the civilized galaxy for 2 things: their extraordinary patience and their extraordinary memory. Yulhari lived long lives, measured in centuries rather than decades, and they had an instinct, cultural, almost biological, for recognizing when a quiet thing was about to become a loud one. This, she thought, looking at the signal structure on her display, was a very quiet thing that was about to become extremely loud. The encoding format was human. Suvat had been a junior researcher during the period the galactic community referred to, in its carefully chosen diplomatic language, as the containment action, 60 years ago. The human colonies, 11 of them scattered across 3 frontier sectors, had been dismantled. The official documentation used words like stabilization, preventive restructuring, and managed withdrawal. The Sovereign Compact, a coalition of 3 of the galaxy's oldest and most economically entrenched civilizations, had presented their case to the Galactic Council with charts, projections, and a calm, reasoned argument about the long-term stability of interstellar trade routes. The Council had voted, narrowly but clearly. The human colonies had gone quiet. It had been assumed by everyone, including Suvahat, though the assumption had never sat comfortably in her chest, that quiet meant gone. She looked at the signal again, NB447 Delta, pulsing from the dead Arethon system, patient and steady, like something that had been waiting a very long time to be heard. Suvat copied the file to a personal encrypted drive, removed it from the standard processing queue, and booked passage on the next available courier vessel heading toward the Helix corridor. She told her administrative staff she was conducting a field review of navigation infrastructure. She filed no other paperwork. Some things, she had learned across her long life, needed to be understood before they were announced. The Anamnesis was not a beautiful ship. It had never been designed for beauty. It had been designed for endurance, a generation vessel commissioned in the final months before the containment action began, when the human colonial administration had begun to suspect too late and too quietly that the political situation was moving in a direction that could not be negotiated back from. They had built the Anamnesis in orbit around their outermost colony, a cold and largely unremarkable world called Sathana IV, in 18 months of frantic round-the-clock construction. They had loaded it with as many people as it could hold. They had pointed it toward the Arithon cluster, dead, ignored, below notice, and they had run. 9,211 people had boarded the Anamnesis. 60 years later, the population stood at 9,347. Life, it turned out, was stubborn. Suvahat approached the vessel in a rented survey craft, running the human beacon frequency as a response signal, and waited. For 11 hours, nothing happened. Then the Anamnesis answered, a brief, precise handshake in the old encoding format, and a docking corridor extended. She was met by a woman who introduced herself as Marin Voss, archivist of the Anamnesis, and who looked at the Yulhari delegate with the particular expression of someone who has waited a very long time for a particular moment to arrive and is now determining whether this is actually that moment or simply a close approximation of it. You came alone, Marin said. It was not a question. Yes, Suvat said. Why? Because I wanted to understand before I reported, and because Suvat paused, choosing her words with Yulhari care. I was not certain that reporting first would lead to understanding at all. Marin studied her for another moment. Then she stepped back and gestured for Suvat to follow. Then I'll show you the archive, she said. The memory vault occupied the entire central section of the anamnesis, a space that had originally been designed as a cargo hold and had been repurposed, in the first decade of the voyage, into something that did not have a precise equivalent in galactic institutional terminology. It was not a library, though it contained more recorded information than most planetary libraries. It was not an intelligence bureau, though the depth and precision of the data it held would have made any intelligence bureau in the civilized galaxy reconsider its own capabilities. Engineer Prior Osei, who managed the vault's physical systems and had done so for the past 22 years, described it once to a group of children born aboard the ship in terms that had stuck and been repeated ever since. Imagine, she had said, crouching down to their level in the way she always did when she was explaining something she thought was genuinely important, that you live inside a very small house. And outside your house, all the neighbors have big houses and loud parties, and they make a lot of noise, and sometimes they throw things at your windows and pretend they didn't. Now imagine that because your house is small and quiet, they forget that you have eyes. They forget that sound carries. They forget that you can see their lights at night and hear their conversations if you stand very still and listen very carefully. That's what we've been doing, standing still, listening. The children had nodded solemnly. Adults who overheard the description found they could not improve upon it. The anamnesis, in its 60 years of silence, had been listening to everything. Its communications array, upgraded in piece-by-piece increments using materials stripped from non-essential ship systems, could intercept transmissions across 3 sectors. Its analytical systems, developed by successive generations of human engineers and programmers who had nothing but time and motivation, could decode, translate, cross-reference, and contextualize those transmissions with a sophistication that no single galactic intelligence service had achieved, because no single galactic intelligence service had been running continuously, with unified purpose and existential motivation for 60 years without interruption. The Memory Vault knew the internal deliberations of the Sovereign Compact's Economic Council going back 40 years. It knew the voting records of the Galactic Council, including the sessions that had been classified. It knew the personal communications of 17 senior Compact officials. It knew shipping routes, military patrol schedules, treaty negotiations, covert operations, and the names of every mercenary fleet that had been contracted during the containment action. It knew specifically and precisely what had been decided, by whom and why. Suvat stood in the center of the vault and looked at the walls of organized data and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Fear. Not fear of the humans. That clarification came quickly and mattered. What she felt was the particular fear that arrives when something you have been quietly, professionally, diplomatically choosing not to look at directly is suddenly directly in front of you, and you can no longer look away. How much of this has been verified, she asked. Marin stood beside her, hands folded, voice perfectly level. All of it. The vote authorization, the operational contracts, the casualty projections, all of it. Suvat turned to look at her. The casualty projections were filed before the action began. Yes. Which means the Compact knew exactly how many people would die before they gave the order. Yes. And the official documentation presented to the Council described the operation as a response to unpredictable escalation risk. Yes. Suvat was quiet for a moment. In Yulhari custom, there was a word for the specific feeling of discovering that a wrong you had always half known about was worse than you had allowed yourself to believe. The word translated imperfectly as the cost of comfort. Why haven't you acted, she asked. You have the information. You clearly have the capability, or you wouldn't have survived this long. Why send one beacon now after 60 years? Marin considered the question with the kind of patience that only comes from living inside a very small house for a very long time. Because, she said, we wanted to be certain. We wanted our case to be complete. We wanted there to be no argument, no counter-narrative, no version of events in which what was done to us could be reframed as something else. She looked at the walls of data, and because we wanted someone who wasn't us to see it first, someone the galaxy would believe. The implication settled over Suvahat like a change in atmospheric pressure. She had not been found by accident. The beacon had been calculated, placed, timed, encoded in a format that would register as unusual but not alarming to standard systems, and easily visible to a thorough analyst conducting a routine audit. A thorough analyst, like, for instance, a senior Yulhari diplomatic observer known for her careful, independent approach to information. You knew I would be auditing that corridor, Suva had said. We've known your schedule for 4 years, Marin said. There was no pride in her voice, just precision. We needed a witness, We needed a witness whose credibility was unimpeachable and whose first instinct would be to understand rather than to report. Suvahat looked at her for a long moment. And if I choose to report now, to bring this to the council before your people are ready? Marin smiled. It was a small and very tired smile. Then we adapt, she said. We've been adapting for 60 years. We're quite good at it. Prior Osei found Suvahat in the engineering section 2 hours later, sitting in a folding chair near the secondary communications array, processing what she had seen. Prior was a compact, practical woman in her mid-50s who moved through the ship's mechanical spaces the way a person moves through their own home, without looking at her feet, reaching for things before she was quite in front of them, trusting the space entirely. She set a cup of something hot in front of Suvahat without being asked, and crouched down to examine a panel on the wall with the air of someone for whom examining panels was a form of meditation. You're wondering how we didn't get caught, Prior said. Suvahat looked at her. The coating, Prior said, tapping the wall panel. We didn't design it. It was an accident. She pulled the panel open and gestured inside at a surface that had a dull, layered quality, like paint applied in many thin coats over many years. 38 years ago, we had a coolant leak in the outer hull section. Nothing catastrophic, but the sealant compound we mixed it wrong. Used the wrong ratios because we were rationing materials, and someone made an arithmetic error. The result was this. She tapped the surface again. It absorbs scanner signals rather than reflecting them. A standard sweep just slides off the ship's profile. We look like background radiation. A mistake, Suvat said. A beautiful mistake, Prior said, with the particular satisfaction of an engineer who has learned to love accidents. We spent the next 3 years figuring out why it worked and how to reproduce it deliberately. Now the whole outer hull is coated. We are, technically speaking, the most invisible thing in this sector of the galaxy. She replaced the panel. It helps when you're trying to listen without being heard. Suva thought about the Compact's military vessels, their powerful scanners, the patrol routes she'd seen mapped in the vault. She thought about 9,000 people sitting in a dead system for 60 years, invisible and listening, building something out of patience and arithmetic errors, and the stubborn, persistent refusal to simply stop existing. What are they going to do, she asked. Your admiral, the council they have, what are they planning? Prior stood up and picked up her tool case. That, she said, is above my clearance level, but I can tell you what they're not planning. They're not planning to disappear again. She headed off down the corridor, paused, and looked back. They've been invisible for 60 years, Ambassador. They're very tired of being invisible. The Galactic Council session was called as an emergency convening, 7 days after Suvahat's return. She presented the beacon data, the initial signal analysis, and a carefully curated selection of vault records, enough to establish the existence of human survivors, and enough to establish the nature of the Compact's internal vote authorization, enough to make the shape of the truth visible without yet showing all of it. The Compact's 3 delegations sat in a block formation that had been their habit for centuries. Chancellor Drevan of the Sovereign led them. He was old even by galactic diplomatic standards, with the careful stillness of someone who had spent decades learning to betray nothing in his expression. He listened to Suvath's presentation without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for 4 seconds, she counted, and then he spoke. The Yulhari delegate presents interesting signals data, he said, his voice carrying the measured cadence of institutional authority. The existence of survivors from the containment action, if confirmed, is a matter that warrants compassionate engagement. The Council's humanitarian protocols, the vote authorization files, Suva had said, interrupting him with a gentleness that was, in Yulhari terms, quite sharp. You haven't addressed the vote authorization files. Drevan looked at her. Those files require authentication before they can be considered. They are authenticated, Suva had said. I have certified copies, cross-referenced across multiple independent intercepts. Over a period of several decades, the verification process is thorough. She paused. Very thorough. The session chamber was very quiet. Drevan's expression did not change. He had been in these chambers for 50 years. He had learned not to let his expression change. But his second delegate, a younger sovereign official whose name Suvahat knew from the vault records, she knew all their names, glanced at him with something that was not quite panic, and was not quite calculation, but was a combination of the two that the vault's behavioral analysis systems had flagged, correctly as the expression of someone whose contingency plans were being revised in real time. The council chair called for a recess. The compact delegations withdrew immediately. In the corridor outside the chamber, 2 things happened simultaneously. A compact priority communication was transmitted toward their nearest military relay station, and in the Arethon system 60 light-years away, where the anamnesis had been listening, that communication was received. decoded, and delivered to Admiral Ren Calloway within 40 seconds of its transmission. The Anamnesis had been monitoring the Compact's military relay channels for 11 years. Calloway read the message. Then she called her War Council. Admiral Ren Calloway had been born aboard the Anamnesis, 39 years into the voyage. She had never seen a planet except in recordings. She had never breathed unrecycled air. She had grown up in the hull glow of a ship that moved as little as possible, in a community defined by two things: grief for a world none of the younger generation had ever seen, and meticulous, patient preparation for the day that grief would be given a purpose. She had been appointed admiral 9 years ago, replacing a man named Ilario Voss, Marin's father, who had led the military council since the voyage began, and who had at the end of his life made his daughter promise that what they built in the vault would be used correctly. Correctly, he had told her, does not mean gently, it means precisely. Calloway was precise. The War Council met in the operations bay, 12 people representing the ship's military intelligence, technical and civil leadership. On the main display, the Compacts transmitted orders to its military forces, decoded in real time. They're ordering a search and destroy, said Eka Solis, the intelligence lead, without particular emotion. Eka had the specific quality of calm that comes from working with threat assessments for so long that threat becomes simply another data category. 2 military formations, one to the Arathon cluster directly, one to intercept any vessel they think might carry the full vault data. They're worried about the data, Calloway said. They should be, Eka said. We've had their complete classified archives for 16 years. If that becomes public, it's going to become public, Calloway said. The council was quiet for a moment. There was a proposal, said the council's legal authority, a man named Dasso who had spent 30 years drafting what he called the accountability framework. The proposal that we transmit the full archive simultaneously to every galactic news network, every independent species government, and every non-compact council member. Yes, Calloway said. That proposal was classified as an escalation risk, Dasso said carefully. It was an escalation risk, Calloway said, when we had no military capacity to protect ourselves from the response. We're not in that position anymore. She looked around the table. The Compact just ordered our destruction. They were going to order our destruction the moment they knew we existed. We planned for that. We built for that. We've been building for 30 years. She pulled up the tactical overlay on the main display. The invisible human vessels, 17 of them, positioned over the past 14 months, using the coating technology, refined from Pryor's repair accident, running silent in systems adjacent to every Compact military staging point, appeared as discrete markers on a map the Compact didn't know existed. The intelligence goes public simultaneously with the military response, Calloway said. Not after, not before, simultaneously, so that no one can claim the information was fabricated under duress, and no one can claim the military response occurred without provocation. And the Compact forces currently en route to Arathon? Asked the tactical officer. They'll find an empty system, Calloway said. We've been moving the Anamnesis for 3 days. She paused. We knew they'd send forces the moment they learned we had the archive. We planned for that too. The council was quiet again, not with uncertainty, but with the weight of understanding that something that had been planned for decades was now actually beginning. Are we certain about this? Asked the civilian council representative, a soft-spoken woman named Olara who represented the Anamnesis's non-military population. Not strategically, morally. Are we certain? Calloway looked at her. No, she said. I don't think certainty is available to us. What's available is choice. She looked at the display. They built a case for our elimination that was economic and political. They called it stabilization. They projected the deaths in advance and called the projections acceptable parameters. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they did it anyway. She looked back at Olara. We're not doing the same thing. We're not projecting acceptable parameters. We're holding them accountable for what they chose. Those are different things, even if they look similar from a certain distance. Olara nodded slowly. It was not entirely satisfied agreement. It was the nod of someone who found the answer incomplete but honest, which is a different kind of nod and a better one. Transmit on my authorization, Calloway said. All channels, all at once. The transmission reached the Galactic Council chamber during a closed session. It reached every major news relay in 3 sectors simultaneously. It reached 17 independent species governments before the Compact could issue a blocking request. It reached private citizens and scholars and historians and journalists and military analysts and trade commissioners and, critically, several members of the Compact's own governmental structure who had not been part of the original vote authorization 60 years ago and who were now, as they processed what they were reading, experiencing something that did not have a clean diplomatic term, but could be described as the discovery that the organization they had served had been, from the beginning, something other than what they were told it was. The archive was complete. 60 years of compact internal communications. The vote. The casualty projections, the contract terms with the mercenary fleets, the follow-up assessments confirming the operation's success, the deliberate decision, in the years following, to ensure that the official record at the Galactic Council contained no language that could be legally interpreted as the authorization of mass killing. They had been very careful about the language. The archive showed that too, the drafting sessions, the word-by-word revisions, the specific choices made to ensure that what had been done could always be described as something else. The archive showed the work of people who knew they were doing something that required hiding. Chancellor Dravan received the transmission alert in a secure communications suite off the main council corridor. He read the notification summary. Then he read it again. He had been in governance for 51 years. He had managed crises, navigated scandals, survived 3 changes in sovereign political leadership, and maintained the Compact's position as one of the galaxy's primary institutional anchors through periods of significant galactic turbulence. He sat with the transmission for 4 minutes. Then he called his military commander and told him to redirect the forces en route to the Erethon system. The call was intercepted by the anamnesis within seconds. Eka Solis listened to the redirected orders and felt the particular clean feeling of a prediction confirmed. She pulled up the relevant tactical display and sent a single-word notification to Callaway. Now, the 17 human vessels activated simultaneously in 7 systems. They had not been designed for spectacular destruction. They had been designed over 30 years for something more specific, the precise, targeted, minimal force neutralization of specific military assets in ways that created maximum information and minimum ambiguity about what had occurred and why. The Compact's primary military staging station in the Helix sector lost its communications array, its weapons systems and its drive capability in 11 minutes. The station itself and the 1,200 crew aboard it was untouched. The anamnesis's operational doctrine was explicit on this point. No killing where incapacitation was sufficient. This was not mercy as weakness. It was mercy as a message. We could have killed you. We chose not to. Note the difference. Note what it implies about our capabilities. 2 compact military vessels attempting to intercept a data courier carrying vault materials found their navigation systems quietly, completely, and irreversibly overridden. They were redirected to a holding position and informed via open broadcast that they would be released once the Galactic Council had formally received the archived materials. The mercenary fleet contracted to provide the Compact with deniable military assets. The same network that had been contracted 60 years ago found that every one of its contracts, payment records, operational orders, and communication logs had been simultaneously published across every major galactic data network. The mercenary fleet's leadership subsequently discovered that their banking accounts had been frozen by automated holds triggered by anti-war crimes provisions in 8 separate species jurisdictions. The anamnesis had been preparing that particular sequence for 9 years. Commander Tarn of the Renthali Compact delegation commanded the largest single compact military formation and had been ordered following the transmission to locate and destroy the source of the archive broadcast. He was a methodical officer with a long record of competent service and no particular awareness that anything unusual had been happening for the past 60 years, because he had been 4 years old during the containment action and had grown up in a professional culture that did not discuss it. He was, in other words, a man who had done his job well inside a system he had never examined. He spent 3 hours attempting to triangulate the broadcast source and then received a hail on a frequency his systems flagged as unknown. He accepted it. The woman on the other end of the connection wore no insignia. He recognized and had the particular bearing of someone who had never expected to be in this moment, but had nonetheless prepared for it thoroughly. Commander Tan, Admiral Callaway said, "My name is Ren Callaway. I command the anamnesis and the vessels operating in support of it. I'm contacting you directly because I believe you're an intelligent person and I'd prefer not to waste either of our time." Tan looked at her. "Admiral Callaway, I have standing orders to neutralize. You have standing orders to neutralize a threat that your compact leadership framed as a security risk," Callaway said. "I understand why those orders exist, and I understand that you've received them in good faith. I'm asking you to take 20 minutes before acting on them." She paused. 20 minutes in which to read the archive that is now publicly available, specifically the section that contains the operational orders from 60 years ago, the casualty projections, and the payment authorizations for the mercenary fleet that carried out the action. Another pause. "The same type of action you've just been ordered to carry out." Tan was quiet. "You're not your chancellors," Callaway said. Her voice was not gentle, exactly, but it was precise in the way that precision can sometimes function as a form of respect. "You didn't vote for what was done to us. You didn't order it. You were a child when it happened."
She looked directly at the camera. "I'm not asking you to surrender. I'm asking you to read what was done in the name of organizations you serve, and to make your own decision about what kind of officer you want to be." Tan looked at her for a long moment. "And if I read it," he said, "and I decide that my orders stand, then we'll have this conversation differently," Calloway said. "But I don't think that's what will happen." She was right. It was not what happened. Tan's formal communication to his command authority, transmitted 4 hours later, contained language that his superiors found difficult to categorize. He did not refuse his orders. He requested a full operational review pending the completion of a judicial inquiry into the archived materials. He cited 3 specific provisions of the Compact's own internal military code that
provided for the suspension of orders in cases where their authorization could be credibly linked to prior unlawful action by issuing authorities. The legal provisions had existed for years. They had simply never been invoked. The Compact's military command structure, faced with a commander who had cited the law rather than disobeyed an order, and faced simultaneously with a Galactic Council that was in emergency session over an archive that named specific officials and specific decisions, found itself unable to process the situation through any of its established frameworks. Chancellor Draven requested a direct communication with the anamnesis. Calloway accepted the request. She sat across from him on a screen connection that was being recorded. The anamnesis recorded everything, and she looked at a man who had authorized the deaths of a civilization and had believed she thought that he was correct to do so. "You wanted to speak with me," she said. "I wanted to explain," Draven said. "I know the explanation," Calloway said. "It's in the archive. You believe that humanity's rate of technological and social development, combined with our population growth projections, would produce within 2 to 3 generations a species capable of disrupting the existing galactic economic and political order. You believed that disruption would be destabilizing. You believed that the cost of prevention was acceptable relative to the cost of that destabilization." She looked at him. "I understand the logic. I have read your internal deliberations, Chancellor. I know exactly how you thought about us." Draven was quiet. "What I want to know," Calloway said, "is whether there was a moment, any moment in those deliberations when someone in that room said the word people." Draven's expression shifted slightly. "Not guilt, exactly. Something older than guilt. Recognition. Our projections were about populations," he said. "Aggregate modeling. The framing was—" "I know what the framing was," Calloway said. "My mother was born in the colony on Sethana IV. She was 17 when the containment action began. She spent 40 years on this ship. She taught children. She maintained the cultural archive. She died 6 years ago, having never breathed unrecycled air in her adult life." She looked at him steadily. "She was a person. She was in your projections. She was in your acceptable parameters." Draven said nothing. "I'm not going to kill you," Calloway said. "I want to be clear about that, because I suspect you expected it. Humanity is not going to attempt to destroy the Compact. We are not going to replicate what was done to us. We don't want to." She leaned forward slightly. "What we want is for what was done to us to be formally, completely, and permanently acknowledged. We want the individuals who authorized it to face accountability under galactic law. We want the systems that allowed it, the classification, the framing, the institutional language designed to make killing sound like policy. We want those systems dismantled. And we want guarantees that are enforced by something stronger than the word of an institution that has already shown us what its word is worth." Draven looked at her for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had spent 60 years believing he had solved a problem, and was now understanding what the problem had actually been. "And if the Council doesn't agree to your terms, then the archive keeps talking," Calloway said. "We have 60 years of material. We've barely begun." Marin Voss presented the Terran Memory Accord to the full Galactic Council 12 days later. She was 71 years old, and she had spent 40 of those years in the vault, recording, cross-referencing, organizing, and preserving everything the Animantis had gathered in its decades of silent listening. She was not a military officer, and she was not a diplomat by training. She was an archivist. She believed, with the particular conviction of someone who has spent a long life working with records, that most of the catastrophic failures of governance throughout history occurred not because of evil, but because of concealment. Because the people making decisions had arranged things so that the consequences of those decisions would not be clearly visible in the record. The accord was not a military treaty. It was a transparency protocol. Every signatory government agreed to maintain open, independently auditable records of all decisions affecting populations of more than 10,000 individuals. Every major vote, every authorization, every contracted action, not public in the sense of being broadcast constantly, but public in the sense of being accessible to independent auditors, to journalists, to historians, to anybody capable of examining the record with appropriate expertise and context. Classified exceptions were allowed, but only under a sunset provision. Classification could last no more than 20 years, after which the records opened automatically. The framework for enforcement was novel. Human archivists trained by the anamnesis, working in partnership with scholars from willing species, would be embedded in galactic institutions as permanent observers, not military observers, record keepers. People whose job was to ensure that the institutional memory of what was decided, and by whom, and with what justification, would survive even if the institution later found it inconvenient. "We're not proposing to govern you," Marin said to the council, in a room that was significantly quieter than it had been during Admiral Chen's fictional counterpart's appearance, quiet with attention rather than fear. "We're proposing to remember on your behalf, so that nothing that requires hiding can be done quietly enough." Representative Suvat, who had been moved from her position as a delegate to serve as the Council's emergency liaison for the human situation, a role she had accepted with the Yulhari version of relief, which looks from the outside like nothing at all, asked the question that several others wanted to ask but hadn't. "And humanity, will you submit to the same auditing protocols you're proposing for others?" Marin smiled. "We already have," she said. "The Animasis archive is now publicly accessible, all of it, including our internal deliberations about what to do with the information we gathered, including the debates we had about methods, including the moments where we considered options we ultimately didn't take." She looked around the chamber. "We've been building a record of ourselves for 60 years. We're not asking for trust. We're offering proof." The vote on the Terran Memory Accord took 3 weeks and was not unanimous. 3 species governments refused to sign. Several others requested substantial modifications. The process was, by any assessment, messy, contentious, and uncertain in its eventual outcomes. Marin found this reassuring. Clean, unanimous decisions, the Vault had taught her, were usually the product of arrangements made before the room convened. Messy ones were the product of actual disagreement. Actual disagreement meant that the decision, whatever it ultimately was, would be harder to quietly undo later. The accord passed, amended, qualified, imperfect, debated down to its specific provisions in ways that would require further negotiation for years, but passed. The compact's 3 senior officials who had been directly involved in the original authorization were referred to the Galactic Judicial Body for proceedings that would take years to resolve. Drivan submitted to the process without contest. Whatever he had expected from this, it had not been accountability administered through existing institutions. It had not been the experience of being treated as someone who had broken a law rather than someone who had simply lost a political struggle. He was not sure in the end which he found more difficult. The anamnesis remained in the Arathon system for 1 more year while the diplomatic framework settled. Then it moved, not to hide, but to build. The Council had allocated colonial space in a system with 2 habitable planets and a stable star, and the 9,000 survivors began, slowly and carefully, the process of learning to live in a place where they could see a sky. It was strange, the people who had been born on the ship reported. Strange to have wind. Strange to have rain that came from somewhere real and not from a recycling system. Strange to feel gravity that was planetary and not engineered. The children who had been born on the anamnesis in its final years stood outside for the first time and looked up at a sun, their sun, designated Terran Primary in the new registry, and felt something that didn't have a single clean name, something that was grief and arrival simultaneously, something that was the experience of inheriting a loss that happened before you were born and finding unexpectedly that the inheritance included not only the loss but also what the people who carried it had built. Priya Ose spent the first 3 months of planetside living in a state of mild, cheerful sensory overload that she documented carefully and presented later as a technical assessment titled Adaptive Recalibration in Long-Duration Enclosed Environment Personnel Following Planetary Transition. Her colleagues suggested that the title was perhaps longer than necessary. She disagreed. Marin Voss made one final entry in the Vault's primary record log before the archive transitioned from a survival document to a historical one. She was in the Vault. The original space, the repurposed cargo hold that still had the marks on the floor where the original shelving had been bolted down during the first frantic months of the voyage. The lights were the same as they had always been, slightly cooler in temperature than ideal, a design compromise made during construction that no one had ever bothered to correct because correcting it had always seemed like a lower priority than everything else. She had grown up in this light. Her father had worked by this light. The children learning to use the archive systems came in by this light every day. She sat down at the primary terminal and began to record. Entry 21910. Maren Voss, Archivist of the Anamnesis. This is the final entry in the survival record series. 63 years ago, 11 colonies were destroyed by an order that called itself policy. 140,000 people who were able to reach this vessel survived. 9,000 were aboard when we arrived in Arathon. 9,347 are alive today. This number is not a victory. It is a count. The people we are counting are alive, which is better than the alternative, but we are not counting the millions who were not on this ship. We do not get to call their absence a problem that has been solved. What has been solved partially, imperfectly, with significant ongoing uncertainty, is the specific institutional condition that made their deaths possible, the arrangement of power that allowed killing to be conducted without any requirement that it be seen clearly. We did not save ourselves with weapons, though we built weapons. We did not save ourselves with strength, though we built strength. We saved ourselves to the extent that we have with memory, with the insistence that what was done would not be permitted to be forgotten, or reframed, or classified into a shape that served those who ordered it. The accord is not a guarantee. Institutions fail. Records are lost. History is reinterpreted. We know this. We will keep knowing it. The vault will continue to operate, maintained now by a permanent archival institution rather than a single ship staffed by humans and by scholars from 6 other species who have found, in the framework we built in 60 years of necessity, something they recognize as useful. That is, I think, the thing worth saying at the end of a record this long. We built something useful. We built it out of grief and arithmetic errors and a coolant leak that worked wrong in the right way. We built it in the dark, in a small house, while the neighbors forgot we had eyes. We built it because the alternative was to stop. We didn't stop. Record closed. She sat back in the slightly too cool light of the vault that had been her world, and through the new window that someone had recently cut into the hull, a decision that had been very contentious and that Maren had ultimately voted for. Because the idea of keeping the window covered once you were somewhere safe seemed like a form of grief that had outlasted its purpose. She could see the star that was now theirs. It was smaller than stars in recordings, closer, more real, the way all real things are more textured and less perfect than their images. She looked at it for a long time. Somewhere in the council chambers on the station in the next system over, the ongoing debates about the Accord's implementation provisions were continuing. Somewhere, Tan was completing his deposition to the judicial inquiry in the careful, methodical way he had applied to everything. Somewhere, 3 species governments were drafting their formal objections to the transparency requirements, objections that would take years to resolve and would probably reveal, in the process of their resolution, exactly why those governments had objected. Somewhere, Calloway was overseeing the integration of human pilots and intelligence personnel into a framework that was not occupation. It was important to be precise about this, but was also not simply advisory, and finding the language for that distinction was going to require work. There was so much work still to do. Maren found she was not unhappy about this. The anamnesis had given her a specific relationship with necessary, ongoing work, the kind that doesn't finish, that simply transitions from one form to another, that asks not for completion but for continuation. She got up, turned off the terminal, and walked outside into the young light of an afternoon on a world that would now, slowly and imperfectly, and with a great deal of difficulty, be home. Behind her, the vault's automated systems continued running, cross-referencing, recording, listening. Old habits, it turned out, were worth keeping. If the idea of memory as humanity's greatest weapon stayed with you, you might want to see what happens when the galaxy tries to erase it a second time. More stories like this one are coming soon.